now some kind of thunderstorm will knock all my power out, and that will be that or something.
Optimistic as I am. Outstanding.
I think we got something here.
Yeah, I can see the little YouTube thing up in the corner.
Yes. For some reason, going out did the trick. I was able to set it up there and then just come back in. I don't.
You got it, just like the joke. You got to recycle the power, right? Turn it off and turn it back on.
It worked great at Chernobyl. Just at the side of it, you know.
Oh, there we are. I've got it.
No issues whatsoever.
Have it. It will be on my. Anyway, we are live apparently, so good.
We are.
All right. Well, let's get started. Hey, everybody, and welcome to this special live roundtable episode of the 162nd anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. So, I mean, it's something to think 162 years ago, the Grand Armies were marching towards destiny at Gettysburg. That's just kind of wild to think about. So joining me tonight, I have Darren and Mary from the Civil War Breakfast Podcast.
Hey, guys.
Hey, what are you doing?
And joining me also is Rob Hilliard from Rob Harry, author of the In Freedom's Shadow.
Evening, everybody. Thomas, thanks for having me on.
And I apologize about that there for a second. I was hearing both of our videos in the earphones and it had me all messed up.
Happened to me before too.
Yes, so I got that fixed now. So I have what I consider some of the greatest minds of Gettysburg that I know. that I personally know. So
that's an important qualifier.
Well, hey, as far as I'm concerned, you guys are the best of the best.
Oh, we appreciate it. We're having some fun. It's a great, and to your point, Tom, it's a great time of year. It's Gettysburg Eve. Or leave the cookies and milk out for Santa Mead tonight. He's coming. So it's going to be it's a big time to here in town. So definitely look forward to talking about it.
Cookies and gunpowder.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Meade kind of quit drinking towards the Civil War, so you don't want to leave any alcohol out for him because he had a problem before the war. So yeah,
I'm sure he'll pass it off to one of his other corps commanders.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, where's Grant? Where's Grant when you need him?
He's busy a couple hundred miles west of here.
Yes, he makes his grand entrance later, but excuse me. So like we agreed backstage, we were going to talk a little bit about why Lee and his army went to Gettysburg, came north into Pennsylvania, and why and when, which there were some very specific reasons why he chose to come north in the summer of '63. So, that comes right on the heels of a fairly decent campaigns around Chancellorsville in his backyard. So
fairly decent from his standpoint, not so much from federal standpoint.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. He didn't get overrun down there. So he's got that going for him. He saved Richmond, but
no, really, Gettysburg was the second attempt to go north after the 1862 Maryland campaign. And he got pushed back famously at Antietam, blocked at Williamsport, and had to go back. But when he came back, a lot had changed in that year. He was still red hot with battles of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. But the problem was the wars really have been destroying Virginia. And so he had to get the battle and the war out of Virginia. He was running low on food. Although all the white supermarkets were empty, they couldn't get anything in the stores. So he had to get the store out. And you hear, and the thing about Gettysburg is there's a lot of people, there's so much misconceptions about the battle itself, about how not just going about the shoes, but about, he was going to come up here, he was going to go to Philly, and he was going to go to New York, and he was going to go all the way up to Santa's workshop and take everybody out in the entire North. Really, the Battle of Gettysburg started because he wanted to come north, get into Pennsylvania, go to Harrisburg, and really what he wanted to do was he wanted to fill up that shopping cart. He needed to sustain his army for the rest of 1863 and give Virginia and the farms a chance to recoup. He wanted to fight the Union Army up here as well. He really wanted to get to Harrisburg, threaten the railroad, and kind of wreak havoc on the coal country up there, figuring if he took out a lot of the Union coal and the people in New England and New York had a very cold winter because of no coal, it would play into the whole Copperheads suing for peace thing. But at the end of the day, when he left the Battle of Gettysburg, he had 40 miles of wagons full of food. So the campaign was successful. I like to say the Gettysburg campaign was just a big shopping trip. It really, really was. And it's one that's just sustained his army for the rest of 63.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
I agree with that. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
sometimes
Thomas.
I feel like, just going to Walmart with my army and shopping because I can't stand the people. It's like getting road rage in the store. So I get that for them.
Imagine being behind 40 miles of shopping carts at the Walmart.
Yeah.
How much propaganda you
Oh
make?
gosh.
Right.
The interesting one, anybody that in Pennsylvania, I'm curious about July though, because, most of the Pennsylvania crops are not anywhere near ready by July. I mean, granted, he was going after the stores of supplies that we obviously had, but he would have been even maybe a little better off waiting until the fall of the year when, our corn is actually up and ready to go and wheat is ready to go. So, I almost look at that as sort of a small blunder in its own right.
Well, he was going for a lot of flour. He was going for things like sauerkraut because he had to deal with scurvy. He had to deal with a lot of different things. So he was looking for anything that was going to help medically his army too. So figuring coming up here, the campaign started, June of 1863. He didn't intend to leave right away. His plan was to be here as long as it took. He never thought that Meade was going to get up here this quickly. He never thought the battle would take place when it did. He would have been totally fine sitting up here, setting up camp around Harrisburg for the entire fall and beyond, and let him get attacked. It just turned out that it didn't work out that way.
Yeah. Is there, Darren, you mentioned kind of the political aspect of it as well, not just the shopping and foraging aspect. Mm-hmm. Was there, and I think you even used the phrase suing for peace, another kind of piece of that puzzle, if I'm not mistaken, was try to get recognition from particularly the British, but some of the other countries overseas.
Yeah.
And I think, well, I'd be interested to hear your take on it, that the idea of, marching when he did, basically being able to win on the road, right? Mm-hmm. He had been fighting in Virginia and winning, but, being able to win on the road and showing that they could take it to the Union on Union turf would demonstrate mm-hmm. something to those foreign interests.
Well, the reality is that ship probably sailed when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in January of 63, because Europe and England and France were not going to align with the slave country. They really weren't. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation is so important. But how it's important politically is the will. If you're going to win a war, you need to either destroy their will or destroy their army. He was never going to destroy their army. But you had governors in New York and New Jersey flip Republican to Democrat. You had the Pennsylvania Congress flip to Democrat. So you saw the support chipping away politically. And the longer that Lee ran the clock and the more support and more havoc he did, especially in a northern state where Andrew Curtin here in Pennsylvania is completely freaked out ever since the Maryland campaign. He needed to maintain control of his government. And that's really what Lee's grand scope would have been politically, was to continue to flip houses, and then basically have the Democrats take control, and then finally pressure Lincoln, or hopefully a Democratic president in 64, to make peace with the South. Now that's really what the whole game plan was. But you could see the clock running out for the Union, because you're starting to see those governorships change, and that gave Lincoln that pucker effect down there in Pennsylvania Avenue, to say the least.
Yeah, no question. And to your point there at the end, if Lee sets up shop in southern Pennsylvania, no chance Lincoln gets reelected. I mean, it was questionable up until October of '64 anyway, right? But if Lee's still sitting, um, still sitting north of the Mason-Dixon line, there it's going to be someone not named Abraham Lincoln in the next presidential
It's
election.
possible. They were as bad as it was in the East. They were having success in the West at the same time. Vicksburg there is some good news coming out of the armies, but again, the Eastern Theater. If you think of like a football reference, I know Tom's a big Patriot fan, so he'll understand this one. So if you look at,
Sorry, I'm not going to let that pass. Tom and I have the same black and gold allegiances.
Yeah.
Actually,
I didn't know you guys. I know you guys are Bruins fans. That's great. We can talk about the draft after. But so the Eastern Theater in the football reference is the quarterbacks. It's the receivers. It's the skill position. They get all the newspaper. The Western Theater is the linemen, the ones who get their masks all dirty and do all the grunt work that doesn't get the publicity. And so a win in the Confederacy in Gettysburg would have been huge politically because of the news in the Northeast. But militarily, it wouldn't have been as important as Vicksburg in the West. So you would have had some different varying things with that. But it's also very possible, again, the will in the North is going to continue to kind of dissipate as Lee continues to win. Because 62, he's coming off of the 7 days. He's coming off of Second Manassas. Mm-hmm. Antietam, he gets pushed back. And it's starting to repeat itself now when you're looking at the Pennsylvania campaign. Because now you've got Fredericksburg. Now you've got Chancellorsville. You've got Hooker get replaced 3 days before the battle, and everything is falling apart. So another Confederate win, especially if you have a tough time defending Baltimore or Washington, it would have been tough. It would have been really, really tough. But who knows? But again, that's what Lee was planning on. That's what he was hoping for.
Well, he was hoping for, that, as you said, Meade takes charge June 28th, right? 1863. And up until that point, Lee thinks he's going to be doing battle against Hooker again. And we all know what happened at Chancellorsville. So he's thinking, his mindset is, I'm going to be fighting against General Joe Hooker. Well, Meade takes command, and Meade he's a different general than what Hooker is. And I think that, Lee probably had to stop and think a little bit about, like, okay, now what am I going up against?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I think he felt like, he had Hooker's number. He did have Hooker's
Mm-hmm.
number, but I think he felt like that. He had that confidence, which is, I was going to say, half the battle. That's not probably a bad turn of phrase here, but Lee had also built up that mystique, and even like reading letters and writings and stuff of the Union generals at the time, that mystique was real to them. And they had it in their head that, I don't know if we can beat this guy. So if he turns around and beats Meade on Pennsylvania soil, it's just one more guy. Okay, we're running out another guy against him, and he beat him too. Then, to your point, Mary, like, he could have, it would have certainly, I don't know about broken the morale, but certainly much more badly damaged the morale of not just the army, but the whole United States.
Especially in the army. I mean, just a year before at the Battle of Antietam, you had 6 corps at Antietam, 7 at Gettysburg, but every corps commander at Gettysburg was different from Antietam. And not just, there was casualties, of course, but it's so politically they're flipping. I mean, you're looking, it's like playing that Rubik's Cube, trying to find the right combination. And they never found it in the East, really, until Meade came along, because there was a lot of stops and starts. McClellan did what he did. He fell back. Burnside was a bad hire, admittedly. But when they brought Meade in, he stabled it. But what Joseph Hooker did, he came in before that. And he doesn't get a lot of credit for Gettysburg because he left, but he's the one who helped organize the artillery. He helped hit a lot of things as far as logistics to help put that army together. So when Meade fought after he left, he had the pieces of a puzzle. Once he knew where his army was, he had to find them. But once he knew where they were, he had a little bit more of an organization because of what he came from. And
I was going to say, the thing that I've you know, said about Gettysburg numerous times is that General Meade wins the Battle of Gettysburg with General Hooker's Army of the Potomac, because he's only been in charge at that point for under a week. And that's not, you know, he's in charge of the army, but it's still, I think in some respects, it is still General Joseph Hooker's army, and that's who he wins the battle with.
Yeah,
But the real question is, could Hooker have won with Hooker's army?
Well, so
right? No, I mean that I'm serious in asking that question.
Well, it's a good question, because you talk about a totally different psychology of how it's going to go. You know, when the Confederates arrive in Gettysburg, you've got your army spread over a 55-mile wind range, an umbrella, west, north, and east of the town. And now you have 3 corps instead of 2. So they have their changes too, with Jackson being gone, and with A.P. Hill and Ewell. But you're talking about, and this we talk about this sometimes as far as what would have happened if Hooker had stayed. Hooker bailed out Lincoln by refusing to with those Harper's Ferry troops. So when I'm going to leave unless I get them, and he says, well, you're not going to get them. He leaves, and what does he do? He gives me the Harper's Ferry troops. That's exactly what he does. But Hooker, coming off of Chancellorsville, when he was this close to winning, he was that close. It would have been one of the greatest victories in American history, but he choked. Unfortunately, he did. Say he comes back and he gets to Gettysburg. He's a Massachusetts guy. He's a Boston guy. He's ornery like Mary, right? So he's going to have to fight. He's going to have to redeem himself now. So it's hard to imagine him coming to Gettysburg and not having a chip on his shoulder and wanting to prove that Chancellorsville was a fluke. So he gets here. What is he probably going to do? He's going to be aggressive and offensive. And if he does, he's going to play right into Lee's hands here at Gettysburg. And so by Meade coming and changing that defensive style, because he gets blamed for being cautious a little bit. But at the end of the day, forcing Lee to step out of his defensive game plan, make him play offense, and now you're playing defense, played into the Union's hands. Whereas if Hooker was still there, it's hard to imagine he would have done the same thing. He probably would have had a picket charge in reverse, and it might have been. And now you're talking about getting beaten again, because now Lee's going into the hills here in the valleys. He's over on Harris Ridge, and he's over at the Reliance Mine. You imagine where he's going to be. But he plays into that style. And so Lee wanted to play defense when he got here. He got taken out of the game plan a little bit because of changing circumstances. So there's your what if. And so it's for the best. It would have been. It turned out perfectly. Backed into that one as far as Lincoln did, but how history could have been different if he 3 days before he kept him in charge.
Yeah. And Mary, back to your point, Thomas. I know we're not letting you talk on your own podcast here. But,
Darren already beat me to my point about Jackson being gone. So carry on.
Well, I was just going to say to Mary, you talking about about Meade winning with Hooker's army. 2 other things. One I know, one I don't know as much about. But Darren, you mentioned about him reorganizing the artillery. I think he also did bolster the cavalry setup and usage. It was very different from what it had been earlier. And then one that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it involves spies. He basically, Hooker, this is, established and really started to rely on in a real way for the first time the BMI. McClellan, of course, used Pinkerton as his sort of government contractor spy agency, but and I don't want to get into all his incompetencies and feeding egos and all that discussion. That's for another different podcast. That's for a wilderness or peninsula campaign podcast. But that that's another piece that again Meade hugely benefited from at Gettysburg that just didn't really exist.
The intel the Union got from people like David McConaughey here in town from the BMI is absolutely invaluable. And he's one of those faceless and nameless people who are in the shadows here at a place like Gettysburg, but it's how instrumental they were, especially as the battle progressed and you got into the later stages of the battle, when now you knew what Lee had in his back pocket, who was in his bullpen now because of what the BMI did. So I'm glad you mentioned them, because it's a very underappreciated group that really deserves a lot more credit than they actually get.
Yeah.
And I wonder if going back to Jackson, I wonder if Lee had not fought differently with Jackson, because those two were almost like the perfect combination. Like neither one of them, I don't think, would have excelled without the other.
Lee and
I would
Jackson.
Now
agree
all of
with
a
that.
sudden, Lee has to work without.
Well, I mean, yes, and no. They're different types of people, and I think a misconception people ought to have with them is they were like-minded. They were two peas in a pod. They were quite different in a lot of different ways, but how they managed their men is completely different. Lee was a macro manager. He would tell you, "I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I want you to go take that hill." Versus Jackson's, we give very specific orders on how he wants it done. So they did work well that way. But the problem was once Jackson went down, you're getting new corps commanders who are used to getting very specific orders in Ewell and Hill from Jackson, now getting these vague book orders from Lee, which caused communication issues. It's a big loss. I mean, the reality is if Jackson didn't get killed, it wouldn't have been a battle at Gettysburg, probably. It likely would have been more towards Carlisle. But there's no doubt that's a gigantic loss, obviously.
There's a really good, one of the best descriptions I've heard of the Lee Jackson relationship is actually in Alan Guelzo's biography about Lee. He goes into it a bit, and it helped me to understand it more. But just to Darren's point, like, yes, Jackson is the guy that can write very specific orders. And then all of a sudden after Chancellorsville, because Jackson is gone, you're having these guys now in a higher position and they're getting orders from Lee and they're so accustomed to having very specific. And now all of a sudden it's more vague. And that's, as Darren said, that's like a learning curve for them all going into Gettysburg.
Yeah, because I mean, you figure they were basically almost reacting without thinking because they were told what to do, when to do, and how to do it. And now it was just go to that hill over there and kill everybody or whatever you need to do.
And then when Jackson did go down, Longstreet, he found out pretty quickly that he's still a subordinate. He's not the new Jackson. So you saw a lot of the personality issues clashing with them going forward too, because of the growing pains on both sides continued up, not just this campaign, but all of them. And you saw how personality changed specifically in the Confederate side when you had all these people going in different directions and a lot of lack of leadership on certain things, especially at the division level that you saw specifically. And so that loss of Jackson trickled down throughout the entire Army of Northern Virginia. There's no question it did.
Yes, definitely. I mean, you could what if that to death too. It may have turned out exactly the same with or without Jackson. I mean, you figure Lee too was pretty much without Stuart his whole campaign. He was off tilting at windmills all over the Pennsylvania countryside instead of heavily reconnoitering for him as well.
Well, he did have cavalry here. He did. I mean, a couple of days before, obviously the story with when Jubilee came through here in the Gettysburg, and the whole thing kind of originally started to get going. George, Washington Sandow is going to be killed by the 35th Virginia Cavalry is going to come through here. So he had cavalry out here. But I think the biggest issue was, Stuart was certainly a big name as how he did it, but he had some pretty good people out here too. And I think the movie plays up that quite a bit. And a lot of that friction is more historical memory than reality. There's a million reasons why it didn't work out too well for the Confederacy. I think the biggest reason was they kept changing the game plan. They kept moving the goalposts, and I think that was the bigger thing.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly too, and the other interesting point too is just why Gettysburg? Just a little town and a crossroads. When you, like you said earlier, I mean, Lee had men stretch clear up to Carlisle, knocking at the back door to Harrisburg and the railroad line, which he had hoped to destroy. And it's like, why Gettysburg?
Well, a lot of that goes back to the simple geography of the town. I mean, if you're when Lee finds out that the Union is close, and he has people as far out as towards Wrightsville, he's got Ewell's guys out there. He's got troops up by Carlisle. He's got the rest from west. He's going to look at a map and he's going to see the roads, and he's going to when he pulls them all in, when he wants to pull that 55-mile umbrella together, he needs a place to go. For every 10,000 men, you need 30 miles of road when you factor in wagons and all the stuff they have. And you don't have I-78 anymore. You're talking about these country roads, so it's tough to get anywhere and everywhere. So both armies saw this hub, this spoked wheel, as a way to gather your forces. And it's no surprise they met on the march, because it's just a convenient place to try to meet. And so the town had no specific value whatsoever. So it was really just a question of pulling the armies together and finding a place to meet and attack, and they both picked the same place.
Mm-hmm.
If
we got one in the chat says, "Shoes, anyone?"
I saw that.
We knew that was coming.
That was coming.
Yes. I personally think it was because Lee couldn't afford the turnpike tolls, so he had to take the back roads instead.
Well, the Chambersburg Pike was a toll road heading into Gettysburg. Then you can see if you can drive. You can go out there now. You can still see the building where the toll was. There's no evidence of any Confederate paying the toll. All I can think about is I see them blazing saddles.
Somebody's got to go back and get a shitload of dimes.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Oh my goodness!
Well, Darren, you mentioned Wrightsville in there, and something that I'm curious about: had the locals not burned a bridge at Wrightsville, had they been able to get across, had the Confederates been able to get across the river, was that always going to be like a separate movement, or could we be talking about the Battle of York today instead of the Battle of Gettysburg?
It very well could have been. I mean, the goal was to get to Harrisburg, and they're going to cross. And what's interesting is the locals and the militia on the Union side burned the bridge. It wasn't the Confederates; it was the Union guys.
Right.
And what's fascinating to think about it is if they didn't, or they were too late, or they did it afterwards, Early's men likely don't get back here for the first day at Gettysburg. So how does that change that first day? How does Barlow not get flanked? Because if they burn the bridge on the other side, or they just don't burn it at all, it's hard to imagine them getting back that quickly. So that's a situation where burning the bridge probably hurt the Union, because it definitely would have slowed down that entire division.
Concentrated troops on the west side of the river. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. I was thinking about it more like, hey, might everybody had Early gotten across and blown through, because there wasn't much to stop them once he got east of the river, right?
Right. Well,
they're all local volunteers, I think, but
they're all trying to get around the river to get to Harrisburg. And so they're trying to get from different angles. And so that's even more of a reason to look at that's where the ultimate battle would have taken place. Again, they wanted the railroads, they wanted the coal, it was a state capital, they wanted to take care of it at that point. But the timing worked out perfectly for them to burn the bridge, to keep them on this side of it, to stop them from Harrisburg. But you kind of stick it to yourself if you burn it, because now they have a quick ride back, and they get back here just in time to cause problems for the 11th Corps.
Yeah. Well, as a Pennsylvania resident today, I mean, if they wanted Harrisburg, they could have had it. I would have.
Well, then Piccolo's isn't going to be there anymore. You got to look at the,
And I hate to tell Lee too that if he was going to come out here and mess with the Western Pennsylvania coal miners, there wouldn't have been no 3 days. They'd have whooped him in a half hour, and that'd have been about it.
Well, unless he had a Patriot jersey on, then he would have walked right through him. But it's again, we don't have to talk for 5. But it's okay. It's okay.
It's funny because right over in Bedford County, there's a series of Union dug trenches that were dug in haste, preparing for the potential for Lee to come up through Bedford County. I couldn't remotely begin to fathom why. It's been horrible terrain for them, but they're still there. I've seen them. They're off on a little back road. There's about, I think, 8 of them, which there again, these were just volunteers with maybe 20 guys that were going to stop the Confederate Army. I don't know what they were thinking, but I guess props for being proactive.
Yeah.
Well, that was a lot of Governor Curtin's doing. The Army, the Department of the Susquehanna, people like that, because you're trying to set up this this defense the best way you can. I mean, John Reynolds was in charge of that, and that's why he wasn't at Antietam. Is Curtin pulled him back, so he was kind of pulling a lot of the strings with that. But the militia unfortunately wasn't as strong as the army. But it was designed to create a speed bump that didn't really work, to be honest. It was really the cavalry when they came in that slowed them down just long enough for the army to get up here.
Yeah. And I think, Thomas, your point about the fortifications, I want to say there's something like a half dozen or maybe even more than that forts, and I'll kind of use air quotes for that, in Pittsburgh, in the city of Pittsburgh, that date to that same spring of 1863, because they knew late spring, they knew Confederate forces were coming, and they just wanted to throw something up to be able to defend. Looking back now, it's easy to say, well, they were never going to come here. But of course, when you're on the other side of the line, all you know is somebody's marching north. You don't really know where they're going. Yeah. There's a lot of speculation and frankly panic.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Pittsburgh, Johnstown, both were up and coming steel and iron centers, just like, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond. Those the cannons, the bullets, they all had to be built somewhere. But
and they had lost the Allegheny Arsenal the year before, had exploded. Same day as Antietam, if I'm not mistaken. So September of 1862. So that was somewhat diminished, but obviously there were still munitions, coming out of Pittsburgh. But
I'm just picturing Lee trying to get through the Squirrel Hill Tunnel at rush hour. They'd probably
God bless him if he could do it. He'd be the only one.
He would have stopped them in Rowville. He would have said, "The heck with it. I'm stopping."
Yeah,
exactly. I'm going to Chili's.
The tunnel monster. I'm out.
Well, I think Dad's is still there. That's a good place in Rowville. It's like a restaurant.
We could probably sit around and talk about why he went to the cows come home, but let's talk about what we're really here for. The battle itself. Hundreds of thousands of men on both sides, in the town of Gettysburg, south of town, east of town, west of town. Let's dive into why we're here. And I think I'll start it off for you because I'm going to get plenty of backlash for this. I think a hot take. I'm sure we'll talk about the high water mark of the Confederacy later. Everybody, third day, the stone wall, the copse of trees. I personally believe the high water mark of the Confederacy was on day one there at Little Round Top. That is my personal belief that was the beginning of the end. That was where they finally stopped them.
Do we let the New Englander have the first crack at?
Yes.
Well, the good thing, there's no right or wrong. It's that's what's good about history. But again, Pickett's charge happens because Lee's failure on the second day. Otherwise, Pickett's charge is unnecessary. And when you look at how that second day played itself out, that was, like we said at the beginning, that was screwed up all day long. Lee wants to wait for Vanderlaw's Alabamans to arrive from Guilford. So they end up meeting at the Adam Butt House later in the morning. So instead of that early morning attack, it's not going to start till later in the afternoon. The whole countermarch fiasco, everything gets going with that. But I think, Little Round Top's important because it does stop the Confederates at that point. But the Confederates did have a breakthrough at the copse of trees after that. When Ambrose Wright's Georgians did break through, he was not able to hold it because Lane's Floridians on his right fell back. Posey on his left didn't really move forward at all. So, I think the Little Round Top, sums up the bigger picture of the Union had to stop that echelon attack that was moving its way north up the Emmitsburg Road. And this is why you have the 1st Minnesota. You have George Lamb Willard. You have Julian Weir's artillery. You have all these armies and these regiments and in these artilleries holding them back until finally the Confederates do have that breakthrough. But Little Round Top does push them back. There's no question that it does. And it does deny the Confederates from having an artillery platform. I don't know if they could hold it because the 6th Corps would have pretty much flicked them away like a fly within a couple hours because they were right behind them. But it is one of the first significant wins for the Union that's going to continue to trail the rest of that day down the line. If they lose that and they get behind the Union, the whole idea of them, the echelon kind of falling apart, becomes less realistic for the Union. So long answer to a short question. I think you're right, but I think that was a variable that affected things later on to maybe would have been a bigger picture later on.
I'm still going to stand on my hill.
No. I think it's a must win for Chamberlain,
yeah,
and against those Alabamas, no question it is. But I think if he wins, if the Confederates get up there, and the Union is able to hold the rest of the line, I think by the end of the night, there's a really good chance they're going to get pushed off. I don't know how they hold it, but it really would have caused mayhem. And those Confederates would have destroyed that barbecue place down on Tawnytown Road. If you go to that, and they would have just taken the whole thing out. So again, I think that's a huge part of it. And Chamberlain is somebody that's a must win in that battle. That was one of many big wins that had to happen for the Union to hold that line.
Oh, definitely. I don't know where I was going with that. I'm trying to piece that all together, but anyway, yeah, I'm not even certain where I was going with that, because there's
there's so much going on. I mean, for me, I'm in East Cemetery. I mean, I love East Cemetery Hill because of the 11th Corps.
I was just say, why is that, Mary?
Yeah, Howard, but also Culp's Hill and David Ireland and Green and all them up there too. That's another that you have to have. Like, you need to have Culp's Hill, and I do sometimes feel like Culp's Hill kind of gets left behind a little bit. But those are my two areas: East Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill are the others that are needed.
And it's such a unique battlefield. You have a little bit of everything there. You have a little bit of the wilderness. You have the wide open fields that were, just perfect for artillery duels. And then the sniper. There was a little bit of everything there. If you've never been there, you really don't have an idea of what it may have even remotely been like.
Mm-hmm.
It's wild.
And you can, I've been there, I don't know what now, 8 times, 10 times, something like that over the years. But I know Darren and Mary live in Gettysburg. I'm sure they're probably finding things out, maybe not every time they go out, but every other or every third time when you see something, and it's like, sometimes if you just stand someplace, you're like, you know what? I can't see over to there from this spot, or I can see over to there. I didn't realize I could. And that's, what the soldiers would have been able to see or not see, or, understand just little things like undulations in the ground. So, for people who are, particularly like Mary and Darren, very into the details and have an intricate understanding of everything that happened across all 3 days, or me, who's not that, but kind of a relatively high level or very high level or barely understanding of it. But even people like I'm thinking about my family when we took my wife and kids there for the first time, and we went out to the marked high water mark. Thomas, I don't want to argue with you about Little Round Top, but when we stood there and we were, we had a guide telling us what happened and explaining, they charged across this field. And my wife was just standing there saying, I can't even believe they would do that. It's and not in a way like somebody would order them, like, I can't believe, why would they try to do something crazy like that? Although there's certainly a discussion to be had around that. But just either side, right? You're talking about Chamberlain's, the main charge down Little Round Top with bayonets, or Pickett's charge, pick whatever piece of the battle you want to talk about. But the human courage it takes someone to stand and look at thousands of people holding guns and pointing at you, or cannons pointing at you, and just say, I'm just going to race into that. I'm going to charge into it. That's I mean, it's an emotional thing, and until you stand there and see it and really understand it, I don't want to veer off here, but Fredericksburg is another great example of that. When you're standing up on the hill behind the sunken wall there and looking down and saying, "Oh my God, those people charged up tried to come up and take this." Until you see all those places and understand the real difficulty involved, difficulty is not nearly strong enough word. Just what was involved in trying to do that and the courage that you would have to muster to be able to do that. You can't appreciate it until you've been there, in my opinion.
Anyway. Oh, I would totally agree. I mean, you could look.
Completely agree.
You can go to Gettysburg. You can look at, just pick a place. You could go to 124th New York, Augustus Van Horn Ellis. Him and Lieutenant Cromwell. Standing up there with his men, staring at the 1st Texas coming up through that triangular field. This is old Lewis Wigfall's regiment, the 1st Texas. Heroes of Antietam had the highest casualties of any battle in the Civil War, even that much more than the 1st Minnesota. And he's standing there one day with his arms folded, just like the statue says, and he says, "The men must see us today." He has Cromwell and himself. He jumps on the horse. They go riding full speed down the triangular field on their horses to those rocks, right into the 1st Texas. They both get killed. But again, what comes across someone at that very moment to do that? You look at, Colville, 1st Minnesota, Lamb Willard, from his people. And then on the Confederate side, look at the same thing. Henry King Burgoyne, Cadmus Wilcox, Barksdale. What goes through your mind at that very moment, the adrenaline taking over? And if they did this thing today and they survived, would they do it again tomorrow? Is it is it a moment in time? And what's great about Gettysburg is you can go to almost any part of this battlefield. And I do it. I go for walks every day and imagine the decisions that these people must have made at that time. Looking to Round Top, charging down that hill. Even with Oates, his 15th Alabama, going up the hill. That's the far right of the Confederate Army. People never realize that. They're at the flank. They got no support on their right. So what's it going to take for them to go up those hills? So personal courage on both sides at a place like this, and it certainly isn't just here, but here it's easy. It captures the imagination when you come here, because a lot of this battlefield is still pristine, and you can still make you can look at the same decisions that they had. That's what's great about
it. Yeah. We joke all the time about, the KFC or whatever that's on the edge of the battlefield, but we stood right after I was with you guys last fall, at Gettysburg Gear, shout out. We walked over, maybe it was right before, whatever, but we walked over literally across the street up to Cemetery Hill and looked down over there. And again, it's like, my Lord, people charged up this, and you can see where the the artillery emplacements are and everything right there. And it is as open and pretty darn steep. You weren't just going to, charge across there like, well, maybe they won't hit me because I'm running fast. You had to climb that hill, and it's eye-opening. It's amazing, and it's it resonates in a way that if you're not there, and God knows I love reading, but if you're just reading or watching a movie made in the 1990s, you don't get the whole picture.
Throw in the fact East Cemetery Hill, that takes place in darkness too. So you're going to do it at nighttime on Culp's Hill, because like you said, how open that field is. They have that artillery field measured out with those pendulum, glasses and those ordnance hosses and those things to measure on the ground. You have Stevens Battery, you've got Weidrich's Battery, all these different batteries ranging down, which is why Hayes and Avery had to attack at night, come across that field. Daytime is tough enough, nighttime, forget it. So it's again, what it takes to keep on going. And the reason why is you have to keep on going, because if you're too embarrassed not to. You have no choice.
Yeah, well, and that's what anybody's been in the service, they'll always tell you, I didn't do it for my CO. I did it for the guy next to me, right? Yeah. That's usually what drives people. But still, it's again, when you're there in person, it is just so eye-opening and really moving.
Yeah, I completely agree.
That.
And don't forget, it was ungainfully hot. I mean,
Yes.
when you're out tomorrow working in your garden and it's 90 degrees, make sure you throw on a nice wool coat over top of that, and strap some weights around your waist, and then go to it. But because that's what they were up against too, especially with the Union not having that great southern cotton to make nice cool clothes with.
A lot of limited water, limited food.
Yes.
Yeah.
All the stuff you had. Not, of course, we know how it turned out, but they don't know how it's going to turn out. You're living with the fact that you could be instantly dead at any point.
Yeah.
So it's a different breed back then. It really was.
Well, what I think of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mary. Go ahead.
To say what I think of too, like, and especially now living here, we were down here for the anniversary last year too. We came down on the 30th. You do start to think like, okay, at this time in 1863, they were doing this. Like, I'm just looking at the time now and I'm thinking, okay, at this time, like Howard is making his way to Moritz Tavern to have that final meeting with Reynolds. And he's never going to see him alive again. The next time Howard is woken up, it's around 4:30 in the morning, and he's got to go to Gettysburg, and he gets up on the Fahnestock House, and that's where he finds out that, oh, Reynolds is dead and you're now in charge of the field. And then that he has to go into the decisions he would have had to make in real time. And he's also coming off of what's happened to him at Chancellorsville as well. So that's got to be weighing on him. But that's, and then you're thinking like, okay, day one, you're going through, okay, this is what's happening. And day two, you do the same thing. And I find I do it more now that I live here, that I do think of that stuff. And we try to go, like, if we have, I have Thursday off, so I'm probably going to try and walk over to Pickett's, where Pickett's charge took place around that time. We did that last year as well. And it's something that, we're lucky that we're able to do that. But I do find myself thinking of like, okay, at this time they're doing this.
You kind of make a good point. You think about throughout those 3 days, both sides lost an extraordinary amount of generals, leaders, good leaders, good commanders. I don't know how many, but I couldn't be, there was many good generals lost on both sides, either killed outright or wounded so badly they weren't able to carry out their duties. So that's like being on the football team and having a new head coach every quarter.
Yeah. Well, and you think if somebody, like when Howard is put in charge of, like when he realizes he's in charge of the field, that means that Carl Schurz is suddenly in charge of the 11th Corps. So he's thrown into
has that trickle down effect.
He's thrown into this new position that he's having to make decisions now. And there's stuff that is happening like on the Union and the Confederate side like that, where these men are getting thrown into these roles that, they woke up in the morning and not think, oh, this is what's going to happen today. They don't know that, but then they're having to think so quickly and make decisions in real time.
And I think one of the things that's hard for us to fully grasp today is, just what you're talking about there, Mary, things changing so quickly and having to make decisions in real time. And anybody who's listening to this, who's, been in the service is like, well, that's the nature of battle, right? That's what you do. But they were doing this without radio communications, without understanding in most cases what was going on literally outside of their field of vision, unless it came with a huge time delay. And by the time they got information from somewhere, just over the hill, that might have been a half hour or an hour later. Well, you don't know whether that's still the situation or not, but you don't know whether that information is accurate that you got, but regardless, that it's not correct. It's not current anymore, right? Whatever was happening a half hour ago or an hour ago isn't happening now.
Yeah.
And you don't know whether it's better or worse, but you just know that it's not the same. Mm-hmm. And so they were doing all those things and making all those split second decisions. And trying to process all that information without the benefit of the technology that we have now to be able to, piece together the larger picture, right? And obviously
Yeah.
that trickles all the way back to Meade and Lee, but at that corps commander or division commander level all the way down, they're, really the only information they have is what they can see right in front of them, and
Yeah.
with the occasional rider or runner coming in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you think, they were still fighting a more Napoleonic style war fighting yet with, for the time, more modern weapons that were much deadlier, much more accurate, and much more effective at range. And, that was, they were kind of in the middle. And I would say the Civil War was probably a good start to that, was a transition to a more modern style fighting. And it just, there's where your casualty numbers come from as well, because it just, rifles were much more deadly in the Civil War than opposed to, the War of 1812 or, the Revolution.
Well, technology was catching up fast. I mean, and like I've said this a lot of times, if this north-south, if it simmered for an additional 50 years, you would have had nerve gas and airplanes in the Civil War.
Yeah.
So as bad as it was, it could have been a lot worse. But as the war went on, you like, to your point, you're going from that Napoleonic West Point style, that Dennis Mahan, Clausewitz style, into more of everybody becomes a general. And I think a big reason for that is because a lot of the guys who didn't fight at West Point, Confederates like the Claibornes of the world, right? People like that. Some of the Union guys who didn't go to West Point, they had to adapt, and you had to unlearn and relearn. When you went, by the time you got to the wilderness, and by the time you got to Petersburg and places like that, when you're going from tree to tree and rock to rock.
Yeah. How much would Mary and Darren, I'm interested to hear your take on this. How much of that evolution that you just mentioned, Darren, do you feel like is happening by the time of Gettysburg? Like how much of the pivot away from the Napoleonic, we're going to line up across from each other and shoot, and then take a few steps forward and line up and shoot again?
I mean, you saw a little of that in Antietam. You saw that. It's the question. But you had the Union, who was very far behind with cavalry, and the Confederates were very far behind with artillery, and they were starting to catch up with each other by Gettysburg. Brandy Station is kind of the point where some people think the Union cavalry kind of met them even. The Confederates artillery never really did. They were fighting with whatever they could get their hands on. These 10-pound parrots that would explode every 5 shots because they were made with cast iron. So I think when you're looking at the Western theater later on, specifically, especially with battles like Pickett's Mill, places like that, where it's basically Indian war at that point. You had Albert Pike with his own Indian brigade, who was scalping and killing Union soldiers, fighting that style all the way back to Pea Ridge. So they all kind of adapted to it. But when you're looking at a guy like a Lee and a guy like a McClellan, the dyed-in-the-wool central casting West Point guys, it takes time to get out of that. But mother is invention, necessity is invention of necessity, their phrases. But that's kind of how it was. But you had styles here. You're looking at the Woods and Herbst Woods here. You had Woods fighting. But you also had line up and knock them down fighting. Pickett's charge. So by the time you got to the end, they mostly, a lot of it because of the terrain, you fully got away from that.
Yeah, I think the terrain definitely is forcing them here at Gettysburg. And you see it in the Western theater as well, especially at a battle like Chickamauga, which is fought in September of 1863. But here at Gettysburg, you look at Culp's Hill, there's no way you could do a Napoleonic style battle at Culp's Hill. There's none. So the tactics are already changing because the terrain is forcing them to change. So I think, yes, you're seeing the change here. You especially see it when you look to 1864. 1864 is, every year of the war is horrific, but 1864 has become a completely different beast than what 1863 is. But you can see the changes starting in 1863.
Yeah.
But there's also a manpower difference. The North had more guys. You had 51 brigades on the Union side, 37 on the Confederate side here at Gettysburg. And it's in every battle that Lee fought, win or lose, he was losing men. So attrition was going to wear them down too. So that's why we were saying before, he was never going to win a battle of might. He was going to win a battle of war of will. And that's why it was important to come up to Gettysburg and get the politicians going and get the people in North without coal and having freezing winters and seeing their sons go off to fight in these random places. Because eventually there was going to be a point when they weren't going to be able to do it anymore. I mean, look at Vietnam, you look at these other wars. There comes a point when you say, is this worth it anymore? And that's what Lee was going for. But the clock was always running on them from the beginning.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rob.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
Oh.
I was going to
I could see too, because the interesting part through it all is Lee's men, their morale was very high. Even after they retreated, they still were in very high spirits for it. So,
they were on a winning streak prior to Gettysburg. Why wouldn't they be, right? They were even after Gettysburg, they were like 6-1 in their most recent set of battles.
They also like the idea of getting food too. That's why that
didn't hurt.
Pennsylvania was very, when you're coming. A lot of these men said these barns were bigger than their homes and the entire farmsteads. They saw these plush lands with all this food and all this stuff. So morale is definitely big when you know that we're going to be eating today.
And they discovered pierogies, so win-win.
Or scrapple.
Yes, I mean, what more could you ask for? My morale is already high too. It's interesting. We've talked plenty about the war fighters, but it's interesting to think about all those behind the scenes. Because we talk backstage. I mean, my goodness, Lee's wagon train stretched beyond the horizon with supply wagons and doctors and you name it. They didn't have all the glory, but especially anybody in the medical corps who had to tend to, I don't know how many wounded each side had afterwards.
You had 10 Confederate field hospitals after they left, and they left a lot of them in here. So if you could move, they took you. If you couldn't move, they left you. Guys like General Francis Barlow, for example, they thought he was going to die, so they didn't think he was worth taking, so they left him here. He ended up obviously recouping and fighting later on the next spring. But that's, you want to talk about the master stroke of Robert E. Lee. People talk about Chancellorsville. People talk about this. I think his greatest moment is his retreat from Gettysburg. And the thing about it, when you're talking about getting that many men, all those wagons out of here on these two roads, on the Fairfield Road and the Chambersburg Road, getting them through the mountains, over the Potomac, and back into Virginia in the pouring rain, with a hill done, hills go up both ways, just like your mother said when it snowed, but they meant it. I think that's his greatest achievement in the Civil War was saving the army, getting that food back. Because if he lost all those wagons, what's the point? He lost the battle, but he had to survive. He had to get the supplies back, and he actually did it. And contrary to popular belief, Meade did chase him. He did not chase him. He just had to be cautious because you're going to be going into the mountains, into high grounds. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, win a battle, and then lose it right off the bat.
And he's also got a very broken army too. He's got, he's lost Reynolds, Hancock is out, Sickles is out, and not to mention the other thing too. And Kent Masterson Brown does this really well in his Retreat from Gettysburg book. It talks about the horses, that you need to have the horses in order to move your army. And that's, I think they're another part of the battle that gets forgotten as well, is the horses, that how much water and hay you need to feed them as well. And that's what is going to move your army along.
Well, even talking to the retreat needing horses to get out, what's masterful is, a lot of those horses were still laying dead on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of horses that were killed throughout the 3 days. So, they had nowhere near the horses they came north with.
Yep.
And still to manage to get out with most everything intact.
And then you needed the artillery. You could not lose artillery. That was their big thing, trying to get artillery. You need 14 horses for every gun. So you think about how many horses they needed to get their guns. The Confederates arrived in Gettysburg with 281 cannon. Do you have an idea how many horses they had? So to get them, they obviously lost a lot of cannon, but lost a lot of horses. But getting them going with the wounded, with the supplies, in the rain, under fire, being chased by guys like Judson Kilpatrick and his cavalry, and getting through here, it's remarkable that he was able to pull that off. And because he did, they were able to feed that army for the rest of '63, when things would have been game over in the East. You saw when Fort Fisher fell, they finally got the supply shut down. It wasn't long until Lee was at Appomattox. He was running for food. So cutting the supplies and cutting that chow wagon was a big aspect to why Lee finally went down, and he was able to sustain himself because of Gettysburg.
And
Yeah,
this is. Sorry, Tom. Sorry, Tom.
Yeah, with you said about Meade did chase. If you look there, he chased him, clear down to the Luray Valley, down in Virginia. There were, I believe, at least 7, not huge scale battles, but battles fought against Lee's retreating army the whole way. So he was a thorn in his side the whole way.
Oh, he never got an easy out. He always had to. He was under fire almost the entire. When he got all the way down to Stanton, Virginia, down Bunker Hill, Virginia, was able to finally rest and drop some of these invalids, these wounded soldiers off. And so that's no. People think the Battle of Gettysburg ends on July 3rd after Pickett's charge. That's really the beginning. That's kind of where the heavy lifting really starts, because now you're in enemy territory. You're broken. You've lost a battle. Your morale is now low, and you've got to get these men out of here. Otherwise, it's all over. He's able to pull it off.
Yeah, and when he got to the Potomac, he couldn't even cross because the bridge was gone. The fords were flooded over from the heavy rain, and he was more or less stuck with everything.
Mm-hmm. The Union back cavalry destroyed the bridge. They had to go up they floated it down the river. They had to go down the river to go get it and find a little place to cross. And Jeb Stuart was the last guys to cross, and they got over there just in time. Then the Union continued to attack, falling waters, where J. Johnson Pettigrew is going to get mortally wounded, and they're going to continue to fight them all the way through. But the battle went on. It went on for a while, and they're losing men every step along the way. But it had to have been a relief when they finally did get across. They were able to get back to safety. Like I said, the battle didn't work out too well, but the campaign actually did. Look at the big picture.
Yeah, and all in all, it still relieved Virginia of, several months worth of heavy fighting. At the very least, it gave them a breather. Maybe not what they needed, but it gave them a breather.
Yep.
And you ended up with Lee being chased, up the valley down to the Culpeper V. You have the Battle of Bristow Station. So it continued as it went. Meade did pursue him as far down as he possibly could, even after he loses his 11th to 12th Corps to the Western Theater in the summer of '63 too. So that's a tough spot for Meade, and he doesn't get enough credit for his post Gettysburg, just as Lee doesn't get enough credit for his post Gettysburg. People seem to be tunnel visioned after Pickett says, "I have no men of my division, sir."
I have no division.
I have no division. But that's really, if from that point on is really when you have to be able to keep it all together. Things are going great when you're winning. When you're over at Chancellorsville and you're winning and you're at the blackjack table and you're rolling, it's easy to be a leader. It's tough to be a leader when things go bad. Anybody can be a good manager when everyone's winning, but when you're losing, that's when it's tough.
You mentioned, Darren, some of the. Oh, sorry, Thomas. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Rob. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say some of the criticism of Meade you just briefly touched on there. And I think the first 2 people to criticize him were his bosses, Stanton and Lincoln, because they wanted him to chase hard. And again, that's easy to be whatever it is, 150 miles away, and be like, yeah, go do it, go do it. And they're not there. They're not looking at all those
Yeah.
dead soldiers and dead horses and those challenges that you just talked about.
Mhm.
But I just want to kind of, and I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not conversant enough with the details like you guys are to be able to say, well, it should have been this or should have been that. But that's one of the controversies today, right? Should Meade have pursued more quickly and more forcefully? But it was also a controversy 24 hours after the battle. It's not like that. That's like, at a century and a half removed, we're sitting here looking at it and saying, oh, he should have done that. We are, some people are, but that was also a question right then.
Right. Lee didn't leave notes for everybody saying, hey, I'm just so you know, I'm leaving. You guys, I love Pennsylvania. You guys enjoy your day. I need to go. No, he was rope-a-doping the whole way. He was lighting fires on South Mountain, looking like they're redeploying in the mountains. Yep. Don't forget, too, the Battle of South Mountain was just a year before, which was some of those underrated, vicious fighting in the Civil War. They knew what it took to go through Turner's, Crampton's, and Fox's Gap. Now they're going to be going against Lee when he potentially could be hunkering down, building a Gibraltar in the mountains. So of course you're gonna be cautious, and so of course they're gonna come slowly, and those fires and Quaker logs and all that stuff were put out, and they were able to sneak through. I mean, the criticism of Meade was when they got to Williamsport and they had a chance with their backs against the Potomac to beat them. Meade did pull his foot off the gas a little bit. And the next morning, he says he was going to attack. And then the next day, he went up there and, oh, my God, they're gone. And to your point, Stanton and Lincoln did write that letter. He was in. All you had to do was close your hands. You had him. But Lincoln finally had that, that moment of clarity where he realized that maybe it's not this easy. So he never sent him that letter.
Yeah.
So I think he realized, like, when I'm sitting down watching sports and it's the 8th inning and why won't you just win this damn game? And I yell on my couch. Sometimes you forget it's easier to say that than to actually do it, right? And so I think Meade realized and Lincoln realized we have a chance to flip the narrative here. We pushed him out of the North. If we get too aggressive and we screw this thing up, how's that going to look? Because now I have Vicksburg just went down. I'm pushing Lee over back into Virginia. I got a twofer here. Do we really want to risk this, knowing it's Robert E. Lee and now he's cornered? And so they followed the best they could, waited for their opportunities. And I think they just I don't think they were convinced that Lee was really retreating versus redeploying. When he left Antietam after the Battle of Shepherdstown, he didn't leave. He redeployed, went north to Williamsport to try to come across that way. But McClellan blocked the bridges. Then he finally left. So they saw Lee. They've seen him. They've seen this plan before. Is he going to fall back up the river and come back again? So they had to be careful.
Yeah. We talked before about Lee's reputation among those Union generals, right? They were, I don't know if it's fair to say they were afraid of him, but they certainly thought he had all the tricks up his sleeve, right? And there's no reason to think otherwise up until Gettysburg, because he kept winning.
When you're seeing your army go through a parade of faces in general, and not just at the big man, I'm talking about the lower levels too, but especially at the commander level, because they can't beat Lee. But it's a cult of personality. It's like when people go to play, Nick Saban in Alabama during the glory days. You would beat half the time even before you step on the field because psychology had you. So now you got a guy who actually beats him, plays the right game plan. Sometimes you want to press your luck. Sometimes you take you're at the craps table, you win, you take the money. If you don't, you take it when you can get it. Especially with Vicksburg going on too. That's something that people always forget about too, is you had that going on as well, and Grant doing his thing out in the West.
Yeah, and Lincoln is very quick to praise Grant, and rightly so, but he's also very quick to criticize against Meade. And as you said, Darren, he never sends him the really nasty letter that he writes. And there was a letter that I found, and it was a kind of an off the record letter that Oliver Otis Howard actually wrote Abraham Lincoln, and he said Howard's reading what's being written about Meade in the papers, and that he's being criticized. And Howard said, we're broken, and Meade is doing the best job that he can. And can you please tell the press to slow down? Can you slow down on your criticisms of him? Because we are a broken army, and Howard's like, we're doing our best. And he said, he has our confidence. He, and basically just telling Lincoln, you don't understand what's going on right now.
You need to pump the brakes.
Yeah, that's it. That was like, and I'm like thinking Howard is like one of the youngest Corps commanders, and here he is. He's writing the President of the United States and saying, "You don't understand what is happening
Hey, he's
in the
told to
army right now."
stay in his lane.
Yeah,
What he's trying to what he's telling.
yeah, he's like, so you're
Well,
all...
and for the record, I need to institute the Lincoln policy with my drafts folder and my email. Like before I send that nasty gram, I need to stop, save it overnight till tomorrow morning because I might be in a better humor. But
Oh yeah.
I think Meade did exactly what he was supposed to do at Gettysburg. I think he handled that perfectly. That's, again, for like we said earlier in the show, for having taken over just a few days beforehand.
Well, he has the worst first week on the job ever. Like, can you imagine that's your first week on the job? Like sometimes you start a new job and you can't get the printer to work. Right. And Meade is like, hold my beer. Battles. It's more than this. Like
his printer was shooting cannonballs at him. So,
he's like, hold my beer. You can't get the printer to work. Watch this.
Well, just imagine the pressure he's under. You're told you have to defend Baltimore. You have to defend Washington. You need to get Lee out of Pennsylvania. You need to do all these things. And first thing he does when he takes over, he's going to find out where his army is, because Hooker doesn't tell him where his corps are, because knowledge is power. You could find your own damn army. I'm out of here. And so he had to know where all 7 of his corps were. And then he had to decide, okay, initially he has this Pipe Creek plan that he's going to set up, which was a defensive plan that really had no chance of fruition because Lee was not going to take that bait. He was going to go to Harrisburg. If the Union Army wants to sit at Pipe Creek in Maryland and just sit there and wait for me, you do you. I'm going to go do what I'm going to do until you come and chase me. And then finally, you had that reconnaissance and force that Buford did, and finally Reynolds did, and Howard did, and then eventually Sickles did. But again, you're trying to decide: am I going to be fighting an offensive war here? I don't know what I'm going to be doing. A battle once. He didn't know he was going to be fighting defense for sure until midway through the second day. He was still debating whether or not they were going to attack them on the second day, until finally Longstreet let him off the hook when they attacked.
Well, Darren, you may make a really good point. It's something we haven't talked about yet, but the criticality of keeping Lee engaged where he was and protecting Washington, basically. And there was always this worry, suspicion, whatever, that at some point that this was I shouldn't say that the way I'm going to say it, but like this was almost some giant feint to get the Union Army back on their heels and get them into Pennsylvania, and then they're going to turn around and attack Washington. And obviously, everybody in Washington, that was it wasn't maybe their primary concern, but it was a giant concern. They didn't want the army to be destroyed, but they didn't want Washington to be destroyed or taken.
Yeah, that was absolutely a huge part of it too. So we were. So again, you're feeding many masters if you're Meade. If Meade had been in charge of the army for as long as Lee had, he might have had a better feel for the politics of what he had to do. But he had to do all of it. He had to defend the cities and theoretically fight an offensive war. Because don't forget too, he also had to deal with Harrisburg and Curtin, because he was the one being a pain in a lot of different ways, trying to keep the Union. Because he didn't want to be the first Union capital to fall. He didn't want to lose all that coal, lose those railroads. That's why he spent so much time building up militia in the Department of the Susquehanna and all the stuff he did. And really, it's the fact that Hooker, Hooker was one of the guys they give credit to for the victory at Gettysburg. People don't realize that even after the battle. Because of how fast he moved, and he moved blind to follow him, it allowed Lee to back off of Harrisburg and fall southwest towards the the Cashtown, Gettysburg area. Otherwise, he had every incentive to go and take Harrisburg, and he almost had it. Especially if Early had got over the bridge and connected.
Yeah.
And you had double trouble up there, and then it would have been better news for the Battle of Gettysburg, but it would have been a bad day for Harrisburg. You know?
I'm going to say real quick too, it's apparently storming here. So if I disappear, you guys just carry on. I think we're okay. I'm trying to listen to it out the window. It seems like it's a bit off yet. So I'm hoping my power stays on. So Rob, your storms are here.
Yeah, nice. Well, I sent them your way. So
yeah, thanks.
Did the best I could.
I'm pretty sure they're going to be headed our way soon too.
Yeah, well,
you guys are
I
a few
will
hours.
definitely share them with you when we are done with the rain and disaster and everything. So, I think something else we should talk about is Gettysburg itself too, because life in Gettysburg did not just suddenly go back to normalcy on July the 4th and 5th. It's they were left more or less with a mess to clean up.
Yeah, they certainly were. I mean, contrary to the popular myth, I mean, Gettysburg was not a sleepy little town. I mean, it was a county seat of Adams County. It had 2 universities and 4 different churches. So it was somewhat of a busy town. But again, you're talking about less than 3,000 people at the time, and they had to deal with the aftermath. And they said you could smell the town for months, for miles, because not only the Union dead and the Confederate dead, but the horses that they were burning.
Yeah.
Going back to the horses again, and all the environmental issues where people were, the water was tainted. There's wells that run all through this town in creeks and streams and runs that are basically poisoned. You don't have an idea about germs or bacteria back then. So you had a high infant mortality rate after the Battle of Gettysburg. Elizabeth Thorne's child died not long after the Battle of Gettysburg because they said because of the trauma she endured when she was pregnant with her during the battle. Mm-hmm. So it continues as it goes on. The town had it was years till it recovered. Some people say here it still hasn't recovered. Wait till Bike Week starts. There's real trauma in this town.
Well, definitely, it leaves a mark. It leaves a mark on the people. I mean, the town is forever changed after the Battle of Gettysburg. But as you said, you mentioned Elizabeth Thorne. She is 6 months pregnant. And because her husband is off fighting, she has taken on the role of cemetery caretaker. So that means she's got to bury the bodies. And she buries, I think it's like 100 and something bodies in the July heat when she's 6 months pregnant. And occasionally she does have help, but for the most part, she's doing it on her own. And, I can't imagine how that affected her. But that this townspeople are having to participate in this cleanup of the town as well.
There's sorry, Thomas, just real quick. There's
and care for the wounded that was left behind. The barns and people's homes full of wounded. They didn't have hospitals to go to. They were in people's homes and basements and barns and wherever they could find shelter to put them.
They eventually were able to put a camp called Camp Letterman just east of the town, and Jonathan Letterman was instrumental because he was the one who really helped develop the triage system here in the United States because of his experience at Antietam. And so you were able to take. Where
was he from again, there?
John, where he's from originally? He's from I think he was from. Yeah, I know where he's from.
He's from Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I know.
Gettysburg specifically.
I was waiting for that.
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. Go ahead.
We're gonna have another Civil War started.
You got a couple up there, but he's able to, because of his experiences at Antietam, setting up that triage. He didn't invent it, but he brought it to this country with different wars. Crimea, I believe, was the first time it was used, but it doesn't matter. But he helped set up Camp Letterman just outside of town here, which unfortunately is in the process of becoming an Aldi supermarket as we speak. But you can still go out there and sort of see it. But that helped get a lot of the bodies out of town. And they were smart about it because they put it on a high hill where the wind was. The wind went away from the town. It was away from the water source that went into the town. So they were aware that sick and dead led to more sick and more dead. They don't know how, but they did. And he's someone here who, Pittsburgh notwithstanding, he's someone here who really is one of the real heroes of this battle. Because how many lives he saved because of his system and all the nurses who were here. And like anything else, any battle with the nurses and the surgeons, those are always the ones who don't get enough credit. But he saved thousands of lives by what he did here.
Actually, the system that he put in place was so advanced for its time that they're actually still using components of it today in battle areas. So that just tells you, you said before, Thomas, we're 162 years removed, but there are very few things that carry over from that era to today, and are, the principles are still being used, but that's one of them.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, and even Clara Barton, who, later on rose to fame out of the Civil War, and was instrumental in here in Johnstown in the flood of '89, then just 20 years removed from the Civil War. I mean, it's
no, that she had some stones on her. Shows up at Antietam with a wagon and bandages, and literally she's setting up her camp, just east of the Burnside Bridge, not knowing that the entire Confederate Army is within a 9 iron of where she is, and she's able to help a lot with them, and goes on. Johnstown goes on, obviously found the Red Cross. Where's she from, by the way? Massachusetts. There we go. So it all comes back, but all these people really don't get the credit they deserve. They really do. I mean, it's unfortunate.
And just real quick about the surgeons, there was a couple Canadian surgeons here at Gettysburg. One of them was Solomon Secord, and he was on the Confederate side. Was it at the Plank Farm, Darren?
He was the John Plank Farm, yeah,
where John Bell Hood was.
Where Hood was treated, yeah.
He was operating on soldiers both north and south for 24 hours straight.
Yeah,
but and we have no idea if he was one of the surgeons that saw Hood or not. He's at the same place. There's a chance, but I've not found any evidence about that. But he is like, and the reason they liked to have the Canadian surgeons was they were trained differently. They could do amputations a lot quicker. And that's why he was going for 24 hours straight.
It's just a different world.
Yeah. Even the townsfolk, and I was probably one of my first, real accounts of Gettysburg that I read as a kid was Tilly Pierce's, which was a watered down account for children. But, Tilly's book about Gettysburg, who, she escaped town to head to the Weichert farm, not knowing she was going to end up smack in the middle of the battle in its own right. But even them who, handed out bread, baked bread, nonstop, more or less, to hand out to pretty much anybody who had a handout.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and people like her, obviously Jenny Wade, that's all of them,
And incredible, there weren't more casualties of the town itself. Even, with the fighting being out of town, everybody was trying to escape the battle, and a lot of them ran right into it unknowingly as it moved fast. You'd think the Confederates moved across from the east of town, through town, and then south and west. So what seemed to be safe ended up being ground zero.
Mm-hmm.
You know why Jenny Wade had to make that bread, don't you? She needed the dough.
Oh, jeez.
I know.
Is that like a dad joke or something?
So many dad Civil War jokes, yes. I know. Okay, I'm sorry.
Thomas, I've had that same thought before about being surprised that there were, not more than one civilian casualty. And when you were saying the fighting was outside of let me try that one more time, outside of town, that is true. But again, for anybody who hasn't been there or who isn't familiar with the layout, when you're saying it's outside of town, it's like, you said a 9 iron shot, Darren. It's like a driver, right? It's not like it was 2 miles outside of town. It was a few hundred yards.
Yeah, it's hey, get off my lawn kind of thing.
Yeah. And like a stray cannonball or anything like that.
and she
could have been enough to kill
she
someone.
she was the only death per se, but there were a lot of civilian casualties, just wounded and injured. But she
okay, thanks for correcting me.
No, I mean sometimes some people get all bent.
It was more after the battle, right? Like the shells that like the kids were playing with.
Well, there was that, but you had situations where stuff in basements falling on them, and I mean, but she was the only documented actual physical death. But not to minimize it, but again, these people have been dealing with rumors that the Confederates were going to be coming into Gettysburg. They've been dealing with it for months and months and months. There was a lot of boy crying wolf in a lot of cases, but they finally came. They had to deal with it. You had the African American population here fleeing, taking off because the Confederates were grabbing blacks, bringing them back to the South, free notwithstanding. And that's one aspect of the campaign that doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's true. So there's the psychological fear of what you're dealing with. Think of how we all felt during 9/11, that day when you're hearing these rumors of this and that. That's what imagine would be like in a town like this with everything going on, because you just don't know, but you're afraid.
That's a really, really good comparison, I think. And like I said, thanks for correcting me on that, because I did say casualties and I didn't realize that was the case. But I want to go back to something you said about the black population for a second. And I was trying to bone up on some of the stuff today, and I think I read that somewhere around 50 or more free black people were actually captured by the Confederates during the March North and then taken back south as slaves. And another aspect, I know Thomas won't be surprised when I mention this, is that some of the slaves along the way who were escaped became really good sources of intel for the Union Army. One in particular, I won't waste much time going backwards on our timetable here, but during the move up the valley, there was a man named Charlie Wright who had escaped and provided information to BMI, which then got passed on to, this was still Hooker. And he gave the initial information, and then it was confirmed that the Confederates were in fact moving. They were on either side of the mountains. So neither one knew what the other was doing effectively, but he provided that information to the Federals. And once that was confirmed, that really is what started the Federal March North. So that's obviously related to the subject of my book. So like I said, it's near and dear to my heart, but those are just a couple of data points to touch on as we're talking about this battle. There's so many, as we said at the very beginning, there's probably literally 1,000 directions we could go with the discussion.
I mean, look at guys like George Sharp and his BMI, what he had all the way through the slave network they had for the intelligence. It's just remarkable. It's remarkable that they were able to do what they did. But you can go on and on and on with this, because there's so many aspects of this that touch this town and all these towns that happen with. But Gettysburg, unlike Antietam, is 3 days. It reset every day. And you had 3 distinct days, 3 distinct battles. When Pickett's charge happened, I mean, that was the culmination of those first 2 Confederate days. That first day they did well. They did everything wrong but won the day. Union did everything right but lost the day. In the second day, the Union was able to hold on just because the Confederates were just had one less brigade. If they had one more brigade, they would have pushed through and they would have broken the line. And because of Ambrose Wright's Georges getting through there with basically one brigade, it teaches Lee to think, well, what if I took 15,000 men instead of 1,000 to try that point? And so because of the openings that it created during that echelon attack, it's going to give Lee the thought that they were weak in the middle. And he was wrong, but you can see how he thought that. At that point, again, everything he did was coming up right. So why wouldn't this one? Despite what Longstreet was saying, despite what a lot of the subordinates were saying, he wanted to do it. And it didn't work out for him. And that was the end.
Yeah, and there very easily could have been a 4th day of battle, because Lee didn't take off right away. He stayed back, and the Union very well could have, had they been feeling their oats pushed on them, and there may very well have been another day of battle.
Yeah, he might have been saved by the rain. it rained like hell on July 4th.
Yeah.
But I think, to Mary's point a little while ago, the Union Army was beaten up pretty good too, and they were both at wits' end. And right off the bat, you're going to start to see Lee pulling the invalids from those 10 hospitals, the ones who can move, begin to set them up, set up that defensive line over where the seminary is right now, and then utilize those two roads. The Fairfield Road is going to be for the soldiers and artillery. The Chambersburg Road is going to be for the wagons and the invalids, and trying to arrange that and put it all together. So he was thinking. I mean, I imagine he was probably thinking worst case scenario, how do I get out of here at any time? But when he implemented that, when you realize that now you're down more generals and more leaders and more people in new roles, how he's able to get that all together and get it going. It's just astounding when you think about how he actually pulled that off. Kent Masterson Brown's book that he writes on the retreat at Gettysburg is just an eye-opener. If you ever want to read about the retreat and what a miracle it was for Lee to get out of here. It probably never should have happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to picture because it was even just Imboden's wagon train was 17 miles long, and that was split in half, more or less.
And you got these guys riding in wagons with no shocks, no springs, and they're wounded. Yeah. They're being let me out so I can just die. Why won't I die?
Yes.
Some of these things they're saying.
Well, and in some cases they did. As wagons broke down, they would leave, some behind, hoping that the local population would find them and care for them. As wagons broke, they left them behind because they knew they needed to go. You couldn't wait 3 hours to fix a wagon wheel. They had to go.
Yeah.
And dealing with the rain, muddy roads, the macadamized roads are still muddy. They're trampled over. You've got dead and wounded. You have to make the decision. And then Lee says to Meade, I'll tell you what, I'll let you have your prisoners back. What do you think? And he goes, no, you keep them. Because he knew he had to take them out of here.
Yeah.
He goes, I just checked with the boss. He said, nope, I can't take them back. No more exchanges. So he forced Lee to take all those Union prisoners with him to slow him down even more.
Yeah, which was brilliant in its own right, because he knew that those were mouths that need fed. Those were medical supplies that needed used. That sounds callous, but it was a tactical move, more or less.
Yeah. The Confederate state here, they were treated one of the many hospitals around here. They didn't have to move, but these Union guys, I mean, it's war. You got to do what you got to do. And you talk about the guys like the Charles Tildens of the world, these guys who were caught, even their officers, they had to be let out of here. In this stories, some of the diaries, that a lot of the men who were in temporary prison camps beyond Harris Ridge, they could tell the Union was winning by the cheers in the distance and how glum the Confederates looked when they were falling back. I think we won this. We won this battle. And then they thought they were going to get released too, and then they found out that they had to go. They went off to Libby Prison in Richmond.
Yeah, and then off to the terrible prison camps down south. That's well, we've been at it an hour and a half, which I think we should probably start wrapping it up a little bit, or we will be here till midnight. And I do have to work tomorrow. I don't know about the rest of you, but I do have to go to work.
Unfortunately.
I start at 7.
Yeah, I'm 6 for me. So everybody, I thank you a ton. This was a lot of fun. I thank everybody who showed up in the chat and followed along with us. I was hoping to take some questions, but it seemed like everybody was content to just follow along, which is fine. Anything big coming up for any of you before we go?
Nope. Well, our next episode is going to be about Canadians in the Civil War, and we'll probably talk about the one guy I mentioned here, Solomon Secord, in that episode as well. So that's what we've got coming up.
Yeah, that'll be a good time. There's other stuff going on here as well. Obviously, the anniversary next couple of days will be a big deal here. There's a lot of things going on here too. We're coming into that season now where Monocacy is just up the street, and that's going to be another one here pretty soon. And there's going to be a lot of times to get out and about. Hopefully, it just doesn't stay. I'd say it's a little cooler. I'd be happy with that. My northern blood isn't used to the shit, so I'm struggling. I'm ready for the snow.
I'm ready
Same
for
here.
autumn.
Yes.
Yeah.
So anybody who doesn't follow your podcast, where can they find it at?
So we have our Facebook page, Civil War Breakfast Club Podcast and Forum. We are on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, Instagram as well. And I think we're on Threads and Blue Sky. I'm not sure. I
know
don't
what that is.
I don't handle all the social media, but yeah, that's where they can find us.
Hey, Thomas, if I can jump in real quick.
Yeah.
Anybody who's not listened to Civil War Breakfast Club podcast is missing out, first of all.
Oh, thank you.
Second of all, lots of good Gettysburg specific content on there on a pretty regular basis. But one recent one, I don't know, you guys can correct me, maybe 3-4 episodes ago, was about the notorious the spy Harrison.
Yeah.
Really good episode, really
Thank
good
you.
Gettysburg specific stuff. I didn't, that's kind of not an aspect that I've gotten into, but I was really rooting for him to be James Harrison just because it was James Harrison. And then, small spoiler, turned out it wasn't. It was Henry Harrison, but or Harry, pick whatever name he was going by. Just really good stuff. And like I said, if you're interested in Gettysburg, but particularly if you're interested in kind of the espionage aspect, that was a cool episode.
I appreciate that was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
And Harrison, to me, they thought he was James Harrison for a long time. It wasn't until the 1980s. Back when the three of us were listening to Devo back in the day, right around that time, when they found out who he actually was. And so that's why it's interesting, is because when you see the movie, or he's an actor from Mississippi in the movie, but in the book he's an actor from Alabama, because in between the book and the movie they found he was from Mississippi and changed it.
Yeah.
And it's fun. Out of all the ones we've done, that was one of the hardest to research, because there's not a lot out there for him. And he's
welcome to my world.
Well, yeah, because he did his job. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We found track. He's buried out in Cincinnati, and a lot of stuff that went down. But we appreciate you listening to that. That was a fun one, because like a lot of these people, especially the spies, Sarah Slater and Pauline Cushman and Belle Boyd, they're just fascinating people to study. They just are.
They are, but then people inevitably say, well, do we know this or do we know that? And it's like, no, but most likely the reason why is because they were good at their job, or the people who ran them as officers were good at their job and never revealed, or in fact destroyed, the information after the war that would have not incriminated them, but would have laid out all that information. And that was not, it's maybe different from today, maybe not that different, where spies were very much disliked, and particularly after the Civil War, because it was a civil war. That was something that was just not respected. It's like, well, you weren't a soldier, you were a spy. That's why when you hear like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, that book title and the saying, spies are differentiated from soldiers, right?
Yeah.
And they were very much disliked, and so people went to great lengths to protect their identities, even decades after the war.
Yeah. That's why Harrison's secret stayed why it's quiet so long. But you could be a spy. If you did, you could embellish your story too, because there's no way to prove it or disprove it. That's the best. Some of them did.
Yeah, some of them absolutely did.
Yeah, and so but it's great though, and what's great about the Civil War is it's the ultimate American personal human war, and almost everybody has some relative, some connection to it that makes you research a regiment or a company or somebody, and it kind of creates that concentric circles out where you grow your knowledge, you learn, and it's amazing. Such a 4-year war can have so much info. And it's an infinite amount of info. And every single day you study this, you learn something new. And that's why they say that there's no absolutes in the Civil War. There's no best, there's no worst, because as you know, you're only one primary source away from oblivion and destroying everything you've ever thought. And that's how we live, which is great.
Yep. No, that's a fact of the matter. And yeah, just to get for an example, I'm not going to Thomas. I'm not going to chew a bunch more of your time here, but there was a book that came out in 2018 that had revealed new discoveries around Pinkerton spies in the Civil War, and it was something that people who had believed for again almost 150 years. And this guy named John Stewart was the author's name. Really, really did his homework and dove in and came up with new scholarship that, that changed what people had thought for a century and a half. So yeah, it does happen all the time. Thomas, if you'll indulge me for one more minute here, we were talking about the heat and how miserable it is in the summer, and I'm with Darren, I'm ready for snow, which I'm ready for snow 365 days a year. But I want to note something here. This is something I pointed out on social media a few times over the years. July 9th, 1755 is Braddock's defeat along the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh. July 1st through 3rd, 1862 is Gettysburg. July 6th, 1892 is the Battle of Homestead, which Thomas, I think you and I briefly touched on in one of the other podcasts. My conclusion from that is the summer heat in Pennsylvania makes people really pissed off.
Yes.
That's the takeaway there. So
yes, absolutely. Don't come to Western Pennsylvania in July. You may get way more than you ever expected.
You're probably going to get in a fight, maybe a huge one with thousands of casualties.
It might be big, it might be small, who knows? Yes, so Pennsylvania is beautiful. July and August, stay away.
That is true.
I would concur.
Yeah.
Just waiting for one of those Coors Light trains to roll through here and freeze everything up here. Apparently, I don't think it's going to be coming though.
I hope so. We'll look out the window here. I hear the OJs playing in the background. Maybe
yeah. Well, God, dare to dream. Dare to dream.
So, Rob, are we working on anything?
Yeah. Actually, I am. Other than besides just BSing on podcasts all the time, feels like. I will have a new piece of short fiction coming out this fall. It's a Christmas story, so that's not the title. That title's already taken, but it will be a short story about Christmas set in the 1700s in the colonial period in the U.S. Cool. It will actually be after the Revolutionary War. So.
Well, it's a good thing it's the winter because it would probably be a war story then, as you've said before. So.
If it was in summer, exactly.
And the biggest one you're probably here for, Rob, you're In Freedom Shadow, your latest book to come out. Where can we find that?
You can find it anywhere good books are sold, or probably anywhere mediocre or lousy books are sold as well. But yeah, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local bookstore, local library. And different from the last time I talked to you, it's now available in audiobook format. Not yet through Audible. I'm working on that. It's just kind of a slow process, but through Spotify and almost Google Books and just about any place else. So
cool.
Nice.
That's great. No, it's good
Check
stuff.
it out. Check it out. Excellent book. I guarantee you.
Appreciate
you will
it.
not be able to put it down. So I thank you all. Again, I thank you all for joining me. It was a wonderful show.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for the chat for coming out.
Thank you.
It was fun. Thanks for having us.
Always fun talking to Gettysburg. No doubt.
Okay. We're still live on